Okay. Good morning. Chag Sameach. Looking around the room, everybody remembers the events that took place starting on June 6, 1967, culminating in the retaking of Yerushalayim. Usually, transmissions between soldiers on the battlefield are not usually made public. But one of the transmissions of the Israeli army, the recording of it was spread throughout the world. As they entered Yerushalayim in pitched battle with the Jordanian troops, they entered through Shiur HaArayot, and they were routing the Jordanian soldiers. And finally, they were able to conquer Rabbi. And it's very emotional to listen to the transmission between soldiers and commanders until those final words were uttered. Hakotel biyadenu, hakotel biyadenu. Very, very famous transmission. And then, of course, they brought Rav Goren in, the shofar, and made the bracha, shechiyanim, and so forth. Very, very important. The kotel figures very significantly in Jewish life. It was the remnant, I guess, of the temple area. The wall itself is not part of the Beis HaMikdash. It's a retaining wall for the Temple Mount, for Rabbi. And the Kotel Ma'aravi, it's simply by its location, the western wall. Some people call it the Wailing Wall because Jews have gone there to pray for generations. It's interesting that the Muslims have a different name for it, that they call it the Burak Wall, B-U-R-A-Q. I guess you don't study the Quran, but in the Quran, Mohammed had a winged horse, flying horse known as Al-Baraikos. And Mohammed ascended to heaven from the Kotel. So he parked his horse, Al-Burak, at the Kotel, and Muhammad himself supposedly flew up to heaven. So they call it the Burak Wall. Okay. The wall itself is a fraction of the size of the actual wall. Prior to the Six-Day War, there was a small section of the Kotel available in an Arab neighborhood. I guess probably not much wider than the wall in the back of the shul here, maybe smaller than that. It was a small section, and people would go there, obviously, to pray. Interestingly enough, that after the Turks, after World War I, when the British Mandate existed, the British would not allow a mechitza at this small wall for praying because it would offend the Muslims for some reason. Rav Kook was very, very emotional about it, and he opposed it, and he wrote an article about it, about the importance of the Mikdash, and he emphasized a strong emotional connection that the Jews have to the Kotel. It didn't help because until 1967, the Jews didn't have access to that. In 1948, when the Jordanians took control of the old city in the armistice agreement, Jews were basically kicked out of Yerushalayim. There were no Jews allowed in Yerushalayim, which obviously meant no access to what remained of the Kotel either, which is a very small section. Those of you who may have stayed at the King David Hotel, right across the street from the King David Hotel, is a building known as Yimka, the YMCA. And the Yimka building was the tallest building in Israel at that time. And every year on Tisha B'Av, Jews would go up to the roof of the YMCA to at least gaze at the Kotel. When the Israelis took over Jerusalem. By the way, if you study the war itself, Israel had the capacity to go as far as Cairo, Damascus, and where is it? And Beirut. They could have gone that far. And at one point, they had surrounded the entire Egyptian Third Army. Now, again, it was in Israel's best interest not to go there, because what were they going to do with 3 other countries? And Henry Kissinger intervened and said to them, okay, Ad Khan, you won, take your victory lap, and that was it. Naturally, shortly after the war was over, they demolished the area around that small section of the Kotel. They excavated it, because where you stay, if you go to the Kotel now, that was all underground. And there's still several layers below that. And it extends all the way inside. You go into the Kotel tunnels as well. It's about 1,600 feet long. It's a very long wall. And it's only a portion of it that is exposed. And of course, they built the whole Kotel Plaza. So aside from the emotional attachment, are there any halakhic considerations concerning the Kotel? We're told that when you're davening, you should face towards Eretz Yisrael. And if you're in Eretz Yisrael, you should face towards Yerushalayim. And if you're in Yerushalayim, you should face towards the Kotel, the area where the Beis HaMikdash was. But what if you are on, for some reason, if you're on Harabayit itself? And there are a lot of halakhic questions as to whether or not you're allowed to go up on Harabayit. And exactly where are the areas that you're not allowed to walk is a subject of a lot of discussion among earlier poskim, where it was purely theoretical, and contemporary poskim, how far can you walk? And of course, the religious soldiers who were posted up on top, took off their boots because you're not allowed to wear shoes. Today, if a soldier has to go up there, they wear sneakers or non-leather shoes. A lot of, I'm not going to go into all the details, but exactly where was the Kodesh Kodeshim, where was the Azara, where was it, different parts. There's a Masechta in Seder Kodshim called Midos. Not the most popular mission in the world, I guess. But Masechet Midos, if you have a big Shas Gemara, take the time and go to Masechet Midos, and you'll see diagrams of how to build a Beis HaMikdash. The measurements, structure, exactly what it is, we'll have to see from Hera V'Yameinu when Mashiach comes, but the Midos Masechta has a lot of diagrams and measurements. So there are 2 Midrashim that I'd like to quote that are very, very important for the place of the Kotel in Jewish thought. First Medrash in Shmos Rabbah, Omer Ravacha, Li'olam ein hashchina zaza mikosel maravi. The Shechina, God's presence, will never depart from that western wall. And this is being written already after Churban Beis HaMikdash, and the only wall that was left is that western wall. The Romans destroyed everything else. They tried to destroy that too, but they didn't succeed. Shenemar, from Shiur HaShirim, which we're going to read on Shavuos, Hineze Omer Acha Koslenu, that Hashem stands behind the wall. Basically, Hashem's presence is in the Kotel. Later on, in Bamidbar Rabbah, Omer Rabbi Yossi Reb Chanina, he quotes the pasuk, Hineze Omer Achal Koslenu, same pasuk, Zeh Kosel Maravi Shal Beis HaMikdash. This is the western wall of the Beis HaMikdash. Not really the Beis HaMikdash, it's a retaining wall of Harabayit, but nevertheless. She'eno chorev li'olam. The Midrash Rabbah, written probably in the 4th or 5th century, right, says it'll never be destroyed. Didn't know anything about the Arabs, didn't know anything about the Turks, didn't know about all the other countries that conquered Eretz Israel. The Western Wall will never be destroyed. Lama, why? Shehashchina b'ma'arav, because God's presence resides in the West. That was the location of the Beis HaMikdash. That was the location of the Kodesh Kodashim, the Holy of Holies. God's presence will always be there. That's the Medrash. The Medrash says that God's presence is there. And God's presence is everywhere, of course. Which is in the western part of the Beis HaMikdash. And again, which brings us to an interesting halachic dilemma. You may notice, and the various minyanim that go on at the Kotel, most people daven facing the Kotel. You will notice individuals who face a little bit to the left when they daven, because that's the direction up on top of the mosque, which stands where the Kodesh Kodashim used to be. So there are those people, now the feet will be forward, but their body will be turned. It's kind of mediate between the various positions, yeah. Yes, well, it's the retaining wall of Harabayit. It's around the base of me, but the section that stands today, up on top, is where the Azara was, the Beis HaMikdash, and to the left, which is to the west, if the Al-Aqsa Mosque is the location of the Kodesh Kodashim, then when you daven, you want to face towards it, so you got to turn a little bit to the left. All right? Your feet are forward, but your body is turned a little bit. Yeah.
Before the first temple,
yeah.
There was also seen as a western wall.
Well, there was a western wall of the Beis HaMikdash itself, not of Harabayit necessarily. But again, you're right. It's the second temple wall. Yeah.
What happened in the first temple?
He's still there. He was still there. He never disappeared. He was always there. And when they rebuilt the Beis HaMikdash, they I guess, enclosed the space where God's presence was, if you call it that. All right. All right. So the Kodesh, now again, there's a lot of machlokas as to the exact dimensions of the Temple Mount up on top. How far each section is, and I'm not going into the details of it, but the question is that there are certain places where only Kohanim can go. So, and people today, there are people that go to the Harabayit every day. The Muslims try to restrict certain activity up there. One of the most terrible, egregious mistakes, in my opinion, of the Six-Day War was Rabin and Dayan giving the Kotel back to the Jordanians and giving Hebron back to the Arabs. Two biggest mistakes. They didn't expect it, and they thought it would bring peace. But those who go, there are people who go up to the Harabayit. Rav Tendler, Zecher Tzaddik Livracha, used to go up every Tisha B'Av, a whole bunch of people. And he would go to mikveh first, and of course he'd be wearing sneakers. But anybody who goes up to Harabayit, very often they'll go to mikveh first. They won't wear leather shoes. There is a minyan on Harabayit now. They try to get rid of it, the Muslims, but there is a minyan for mincha on the Harabayit. But there's a lot of discussion as to where you're allowed to walk on Harabayit, because there are certain sections that were only for Kohanim. And because there's so many machloksim, there are many rabbanim who are of the opinion that perhaps it's better not to walk on Harabayit. Others say, no, you should. And there are many activists who push for full access. Every day. I don't know about Shabbos, but during the week, they try to sneak in a quick mincha. I don't know if it's the full Amida or Heicha Kedusha, but there's a group that goes up there every day and they sneak in a quick mincha every day. There's a group that does that. Many Rishonim and Achronim over history have gone up to Har HaBayit. Not exactly sure where they can walk, where they can't walk. A lot of discussion about that. Whose definition was accepted. There's an interesting halakhic discussion about, I guess you'd call it airspace over the Har HaBayit or around the Har HaBayit. For example, if you are in a doorway facing inward, then you're considered inside the Har HaBayit area or inside the Beit HaMikdash area. So once you're in that space, you're in terms of, and there are halakhic implications in terms of Korban Pesach, if a person is tamei, and that the accepted halakhic position is bia b'miktzah shmei bia. Entering, even partially, is considered entering. So if you are tamei, you're not allowed to go there, but if you stick your hand or foot in that doorway, you're in. So the airspace, if you will, is a lot of interesting discussions about that, which leads us to the next question. I think I discussed it once before. If you can't enter the area of the Har HaBayit, and there are certain areas that only Kohanim can go, and certainly if you're a Tahar and so forth and so on, what about the crevices in the wall of the Kotel? Does that have any innate Kedusha? Right? I mean, if you can't go into a doorway leading into the area, and by the way, I should mention parenthetically, and I've said this before, that as important as the Western Wall is, I think the Southern Wall is a very, very, perhaps even more important location. If you go around the corner, the Southern Wall, a lot of steps, which is where people actually entered the Beis HaMikdash. Now, the actual door has been cemented over, but the steps are there. That people entered the Beis HaMikdash from the south. And also, there's a museum. I urge you to go to, you have to make a reservation, but there's a museum that has a wonderful audiovisual presentation of what it was like to go into the Beis HaMikdash and the Karbanos and so forth. And the southern excavation area, you'll see, for example, the stalls where the money lenders or, because people, the money changers, rather, excuse me, the money changers, people came from outside Israel, they had to exchange their money for shkolim or slaim or dinarim to give to for the Beis HaMikdash to purchase animals. There were other stalls where they kept animals for korbanos, big animals, small animals. Those stalls are still there. So the southern wall excavation area is a very important area to visit. Next time in Yerushalayim.
In the 2000, Barak and negotiated with our situation.
Right.
One of the things that Clinton, I think, Clinton administration proposed was the solution of that was that Israel maintained the underground part and the Arabs could build.
A lot of negotiating, underground, above ground. And by the way, the Kotel area that we're seeing now goes down below level, I don't know, another 70 feet. It's a huge, huge wall. And those stones weigh hundreds of tons. How they put those stones there, how they quarried them there, and there's no cement in between the stones. It's just the weight of the stones holding it in place, which the Mishnah describes in the beginning, in the first parak of Bava Basra, when it talks about how you build stuff. How you can build with cement, you can build without cement. And the Kotel is obviously built without cement, but the weight of these stones, how they lifted it, how they pulled it, how they moved from the quarry. And if you go further into the tunnels, you also see that, because the wall goes very, very far. Okay, let's see. So sticking your hands, again, putting your hands in the crevices of the kotel, ultimately the kedusha of the Har HaBayit ultimately doesn't extend, because that wall is not really part of the Beis HaMikdash. It's an external, it's a retaining wall below the surface. There's a lot of machloks about, but generally speaking, obviously people put notes, so it's not a problem. You can stick your hand in the crevices of the kotel, it's not a problem. There are those who are more machmir, but given the fact that this is an old practice, we are certainly lenient about it, and you can certainly put your hands into the kotel.
Wally,
yes.
what about
Yes.
the practice of putting a note inside the prayer or something inside the wall? How is that looked at by most people?
It's not a, I mean, people, you know, people have been doing this for generations, and certainly not problematic. There is a whole strain in Jewish thought in terms of you know, going to tzaddikim, putting notes, fitlach. It's certainly, I would say, part of Jewish folklore, put it that way. I would say putting a note in the kotel is part of Jewish folklore. It's been sanctioned by many rabbinic authorities to do that. You put the name of the person that you're praying for, the mother's name, you stick it in the kotel, and every so often they go out and they clean out these notes. I don't know what they do with them once they clean them up, but what do they do with them once they burn them? Okay. But again, a version, by the way, a version of sticking notes in the kotel crevices is not unlike going to a Hasidic Rebbe and giving him a kvittel, a similar type of a note, the person's name on it. You should pray for that person. So it's a very old tradition. An interesting question. Now, again, it's before 67, you didn't have a big area for davening. A small area in the Arab section where a few people gathered on a regular basis to daven, men and women. There was no mechitza there. After the Six-Day War, they demolished that whole neighborhood. They excavated. They went down about 70 feet, and there's still more to go. They built the Kotel Plaza. In the areas to the side were a number of little shuls right adjacent to the kotel inside. What about the back area? The kotel area, in the area in front of the kotel, has a din of a Beis HaKnesses. It's a shul. That's why there's a mechitza there. What about the plaza area in the back, where tourists stand to take pictures and people gather and they schmooze and they go back and forth and soldiers use it as a shortcut? Does that area have any innate kedusha or not? Is that considered adjacent to the kotel? Is there any sanctity to that plaza area in the back behind the fence? Fascinating machlokas, because there's an area in halacha called Rechovo Shel Ir. The open streets and plazas of a city. If you learn Maseches Tanis, you'd know that in a time of famine or a time of tzara, or whatever the case might be, a plague or what have you, they would bring a Sefer Torah into the middle of the town, and they would daven there, outside, not in the shul, in the middle of the town. They would daven, especially on a Tanis Tzibur, or any particular emergency that came up. So the Rechovo Shel Ir, the center of town, or the outside of the Beis HaKnesses, also has a certain area of kedusha to it. On Yom Tov, on Tisha B'Av, that area is full of people who are davening. If you ever see pictures, or if you've ever been in Israel on Tisha B'Av, or during Yontif, or Chol HaMoed, you can't, the area in front of that hotel cannot contain the thousands of people that come there to daven. It goes all the way in the back. So they do daven in that back area. So some contemporary poskim also deal with the question of Rechava Shalir doesn't have any innate sanctity or kedusha of its own, because this is a contemporary issue. And the contemporary poskim do debate this. The two major ones who argue about it, that there's Rav Zolti and Rav Nebenzal, two very venerated rabbis last generation in Yerushalayim, argued about it. Rav Zolti is of the opinion that the overflow from the Kotel area does have Kedushas Pesach Nesses, and even though it's only used occasionally, it still has a certain amount of Kedusha, just like the Rechava Shalir on a Tanis Tzibur. Rav Nebenzal disagrees. And these are not lightweights, and these are not people who are known to be lenient. They're very right-wing rabbis. And he says, very practically, nobody ever treated this area with Kedusha. You think about it. There's no attempt to get people to wear yarmulkes there. There's no attempt to get tourists to dress in its tznius fashion in that area, in the back area. There used to be, I remember years ago, there used to be a police station there. So therefore, it's treated like any other space that might be used for a temporary minyan, which opens up a whole other interesting discussion, is if you use a place for a temporary davening, so for that temporary period, it has Kedusha. But what about after you finish davening? Does it retain any sanctity or not? And this is part of that same machlokas. So the Kotel area itself, for sure. The Kotel area behind the fence, which is used occasionally on Yontif or on Yom HaAtzmaut or any other special, like today, I'm sure the place was packed. The place was packed. And by the way, just parenthetically, as I'm thinking about it, I meant to ask Rabbi Yudin this question. Normally, on days when you don't say Tachanun, an Ovel doesn't daven for the Yomid. Right? Yom HaAtzmaut, Yom Yerushalayim, we don't say Tachanun, at least not here. So technically, an Ovel shouldn't daven. Similarly, on days when you don't say Tachanun, you also don't say Lam Natseach in between Ashrei and Muvah L'Tzion. Why did we say it today? I didn't say it, but why did So as a Gabbai, you should be aware of some of these issues as well. Yom HaAtzmaut, Yom Yerushalayim, as days of celebration, will, I am confident, be eventually absorbed into the Jewish calendar as an official Yontif. If you look at Hanukkah, Hanukkah did not begin to be observed the way we observe it until hundreds and hundreds of years after the fact. Because if you look in the Gemara, there were many different ways of celebrating Hanukkah. I mean, Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai argued about which way you would light candles, but lighting candles, as I mentioned once before, was as a secondary stage. Initially, there were torchlight parades, and then that changed, and the Chanukiah was born, and then how to light it, and they were debating this 400 years later in Bavel. So apparently there were many different ways of observing Hanukkah until it was decided this is what we're going to do. So similarly, I personally feel that if enough people in the Jewish community observe Yom HaAtzmaut and Yom Yerushalayim by not saying Tachanun, by saying Hallel, with or without a bracha is a separate issue. Eventually, I think, it'll become standardized and accepted as one of the minor holidays, so to speak, like Hanukkah and Purim. It's an evolution. It'll develop. Maybe not in our lifetime, but eventually more and more people will begin to observe it. There are people, there's a famous question that they asked Rav Shach, the Ponevezher Rav, they asked him, what does he do on Yom Ha'atzmaut? What does he do? So the answer that he gave was, I do what Ben Gurion does. I don't say Tachanun, I don't say Hallel. Yeah. Yes, Herod did build a retaining wall, correct. Yes, he was.
Yet he built something that it's a mitzvah to go down.
If you look at the first parak above Basra, it's a whole long discussion about King Herod. Herod was not a good guy. However, he was known historically as Herod the Great. But Herod the Great is an abbreviation of Herod the Great Builder. He built palaces all over Israel. Masada has one of his palaces, Herodium. He built the retaining wall. He built the Beis HaMikdash. He improved upon it, quote unquote. He made it more fancy, if I can use that word. And even though he was an Idumean, like a half Jew, and he claimed to have yichus to the Chashmonaim, although that's disputed. Herod was the one that built the most of the second Beis HaMikdash and the Kotel itself, as well as many other things in Yerushalayim. Which is interesting that it's become the focus of what the Beis HaMikdash area is, being built by somebody who didn't really care for halacha or the Beis HaMikdash, just cared about his own personal status as a great builder. But it's true. But Herod built that wall and also added, which the Chachamim weren't too happy with, certain architectural aspects of the Second Temple. Yes?
I just want to continue my thought. In modern times, the Jews who built Eretz Israel in the 1880s, were secular Jews. They were not Orthodox. They were secular Jews.
Yes.
Not that I'm not comparing them to Herod, but they were not observant Jews. So in both cases, non-observant Jews built the country.
Okay. So the observation is correct that the builders of the modern state of Israel were not Orthodox or observant in any way, which is true. Yet, they had a Jewish consciousness.
Absolutely.
And they had an understanding of what Jewish destiny was all about. And it's not for us to judge the religiosity of any other individual. I could say that their motivation was l'shem shamayim, because they understood whether it was Herzl, who was totally assimilated and reacted to the Dreyfus trial, whether it was the socialists like Ben Gurion and others who pioneered the beginning of the state of Israel. It's fascinating when you think of some of these people. Ben Gurion, if you go to Sde Boker, which is where he lived, his farm, and you walk through his house, you look at his bookcase. There was a Shas, there were Mikros Gedolos. He was known as a biblical scholar, yet he was totally non-observant. So it's not for us to judge, but the fact remains that from a observance perspective, they were not observant. But sometimes, God has his own way of making different people as his emissaries, and we have to be grateful that they did what they did. Yes, Sam.
From what I've read, when the Appeal Commission had experience in it. But it would resolve the issue of the RFI. What they're working that up. Why do we have this land that we've been here for 2,000 years
Right.
or something? Quoted the coverage.
Yeah, well,
And I think all of maybe the
In-
other Zionist leaders at that time.
well, you don't have to go that, in 67 in the UN, Abba Ibn was quoting Chumash. And Ben Gurion always used to quote Psukim. I remember he came to yeshiva when I was in high school. And he had his yarmulke in between his two big tufts of hair. And he gave a very nice speech in Hebrew. He used to make up his own Hebrew words, by the way, Ben Gurion, fascinating guy. But he gave a speech promoting Aliyah, but he also quoted a lot of psukim because he knew them. In any event, go out and enjoy some falafel today. Enjoy Yom Yerushalayim. Hopefully, in our lifetime or shortly thereafter, it will become accepted in the Jewish calendar as part of the normal, I guess, rotation of Jewish holidays. But there's a lot of halachos involved in Yerushalayim. There are certain things you can only do in Yerushalayim. You can't do anyplace else. There are halachos about, going up to the Harabayit. What exactly is Harabayit? Where can you go? Where can't you go? Some of the dimensions are subject to dispute because the area between the Kodesh Kodashim and the Chel and other areas of the base of Mikdash was much closer than what it looks like today up on top. Are you allowed to go into the mosque on top of the hotel? Is a separate question, because if that was where the Kodesh Kodashim was, in all probability it was. So there are a lot of interesting halakha questions that are still being debated, and there is sufficient room within some postscript for people to go up on Harabai, as long as you know exactly where you're walking, not to go too far in this direction, too far in that direction. So for those who say better enough not to go up at all. But there are people that, Ariel Sharon caused a big tumult when he went up on top of Harabayit, just to show that it's ours. So, as I said, enjoy a falafel today. Think about the miracle in our own time of not only of Eretz Yisrael, but of Yerushalayim, once again in our hands and never to be taken away again or divided, hopefully, in any which way. Any questions or comments? Okay. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Wally. No.
If the Arabs consider it holy, why would they throw garbage out the whole time?
I'll throw the garbage off the coat. I don't know.
I know it's just kind of weird. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, of course,
Even today, there are Christians that support Israel. Israel would be in trouble.
Sure.
Monetarily,
Absolutely.
visiting Israel, supporting all kinds of
Absolutely.
institutions.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
it hasn't changed.
Nothing has changed. Absolutely.
Okay, Michael, you ready?
Shiva